Greetings, everybody. I'm Alec Baldwin. Thank you for coming. We rebooted the Hamptons Institute a couple years ago after we had, they were doing this programming a few years ago, produced by, I'm sorry? We rebooted the Hamptons Institute after it, we stopped for a while. Mickey Strauss, who was the former chairman of the board of Guildhall, produced a program which was largely financial and financial services oriented. He was a money guy, if you will, and it would shut down for a couple of years, and then we started it again, and we've had some wonderful programs over the last couple of years, and this year is no different. Tonight we have a program on, as you know, on plastics pollution. Next week we have a program on the Me Too Time's Up issue and sexual harassment. And then our last program on the 20th is about the opioid crisis and the drug abuse crisis in this country and in this area. But I want to just begin by, I want to get started because we have a lot of ground to cover. As I was reading this material over the last couple of days, boy, do we have a lot of ground to cover. But we're very, very fortunate with this program, like our other programs, to have some really great participants who are experts in this field. So I'm going to bring them out after I make this introduction. Barbara Hendrie is the newly appointed Regional Director for the United Nations Environment North America Office. She has over 2 decades experience in sustainable development and humanitarian affairs, working for both the United Kingdom and the United States governments. She was a senior official in the United Kingdom's Department for International Development from 1999 to 2015, and a senior political appointee of the U.S. President from 2015 to 2016, based in the United States Agency for International Development. And her bio goes on, but I'm going to shorten everybody's bio for the purposes of our program. Please welcome Barbara Hendrie. Come on out here, Barbara. More applause, please, for Barbara Hendrie. You're in the middle. You're going to sit in the middle. Dune Ives is the executive director of Lonely Whale, where she designs and leads change-making ocean conservation initiatives to address key drivers of environmental degradation and species decline. Her expertise in sustainability and environmental business issues across corporate, municipal, nonprofit, and philanthropic institutions, coupled with a PhD in psychology, allows for an innovative yet practical approach to resolving systemic challenges for our environment. Please welcome Dune Ives. Come on in. You're on this end over here. Great. And lastly, Tierney is a biologist and award-winning documentary filmmaker, and she is a National Geographic Explorer and Research Associate at the California Academy of Sciences. She has traveled to every continent and visited more than 60 countries. She is an expert on giant ocean sunfishes and the Daily Explorer in the National Geographic's Animal Jam, an online world boasting 70 million registered players in 120 countries and 5 languages. And what I found interesting in her bio was that she is working on additional research initiatives, include investigating how nature imagery influences brain activity and the effects of nature on incarcerated populations. I found that very, very interesting. Please welcome Tierney. Great. Now, for the purposes of our conversation, because we are recording this for a certain podcast on WNYC Radio, we're going to, each question I'm going to the best of my ability, be specific to one of our 3 guests. So I want to start with Barbara, and I want to, obviously talk about you. You had mentioned backstage, and I read in some of the material you gave us that about the evolution of plastics pollution or plastics production, rather, in this country over the last many, many years. Why don't you talk about, how do we get where we are now?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Alec. It's great to be here, and thank you so much for having the panel on this incredibly important issue. So, plastic production really started primarily in the US and Western Europe in 1950. In that year, the world produced about 2.3 million tons of plastic. And this was this incredible wonder material. It was lightweight, it was cheap, incredibly durable. And so plastic production since then has basically risen exponentially, so that in 2014, the world produced 311 million tons of plastic. And last year, we produced 488 million tons of plastic. And a huge percentage of that, and an increasing percentage of that, is what we call single-use or disposable plastic. So the stuff that your consumer goods come wrapped in, the plastic bags that you get at your supermarket, the plastic water bottle that people use for an average of about 15 minutes and then throw away. And what that has meant is that since 1950, there are an estimated 9 billion tons of plastic in the world that we have generated as a human species, of which 6.3 billion are in the form of plastic waste. And so we've got a problem because that volume of plastic waste has just completely overwhelmed our waste management and infrastructure capabilities, particularly in developing countries where infrastructure is not very strong anyway. And so what's happening is that about 8 million tons of plastic waste a year is leaking into the ocean. And the majority of that is the plastic that we use for 15 minutes and throw away.
And what are the ways, when you say leaking into the ocean, what are the ways that that's happening?
So most of the plastic that gets into the ocean comes from land. It's not a problem of people throwing things off of ships, although that can be an issue. What happens is that all that plastic waste, that 6.3 billion, only 9% of it has been recycled. I think people have the idea that, oh, well, plastic, it's getting recycled. It's actually not. Only 9% recycled, something like 12% incinerated, and the rest, 79%, are put in landfills or dumped basically as litter in coastal areas or dumped into rivers, and then they all find their way into the ocean environment.
Now, when you wrote my cheat sheet here, you wrote, future project business as usual. What was the question?
So
tell me the question I should be asking you. I have all the other questions down, but your code you wrote down here. Future projections of plastic production.
So the point is, what's going to happen in the future?
What's going to happen in the future?
I'm glad you asked me that question, because actually that's the thing that really keeps me up at night and is kind of horrifying. So the projection is that plastic production will double in 20 years and quadruple by the year 2050. So basically, instead of bending the curve and reducing the amount of plastic that we produce, it's actually going up exponentially.
So let me ask you a question as we go along that's linked to each of these points you're going to make. And that is, what's the most problematic one to address? Meaning you hear people now say, and I'm not saying this mockingly, but where we live now in Eastern Long Island and everywhere we go, it's like, we got to get rid of the plastic straws. And I refuse to believe that getting rid of all the plastic straws is going to make a dent in the problem. What's the plastic product or among the products, or what category of products is the most problematic? Is it packaging?
So there's a combination of things. It's plastic packaging is a huge problem. Straws, plastic bags, it's basically all of the plastic that we use and dispose. So that, as UN Environment Program, we have really focused our efforts on what we call single-use plastics. Those are the things that, have value for maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then they lose their value because they're not, they have one life, and so they get thrown away, and that's why they stay in the environment, is because they don't have another value beyond that.
My next question is for Tierney Teese. What's the impacts on the ocean? I mean, this is a very broad question, but give us an example or a couple of examples.
Yeah, so as Barbara was saying, we have 8 million tons of this going into the ocean, and it's not just large pieces. The pieces break down into microplastics, and I'm sure everyone's been hearing about these in the news. And those microplastics, they're not just an impediment to digestion, or when you're eating plastics, you don't just get entangled in them or they block digestion. Plastics can also as they break down, release a lot of their additives that are in there, like the hardeners and the softeners, the phthalates.
Benzene.
And the bisphenol A's and things like this. And those are known endocrine disruptors, which can affect your hormone system and your metabolism, your fertility, and immune responses. And they also can attract and adhere persistent organic pollutants like PCBs and DDTs. And so when an animal ingests those, and all the way down to the tiniest little zooplankton, when they ingest them, they're not only getting physical obstruction that's indigestible, but a poison-packed pill as well that can then pervade the system. And there are some reports where researchers have found that these little nanoparticles can actually pass through the blood-brain barrier and get into the brains of small zooplankton. So I mean, it can go through the whole body. So in the ocean right now, we call it like a plastic smog, because you can sample, and it's these tiny particles and microfibers from our clothing, like, about 70% of our clothing is petroleum-based, our polyesters and things like this, and our chinchillas and our fleeces that keep us.
When you wash your clothes
warm.
and the water comes out and goes into the septic system in your house or in a sewage system, does residue of plastic come off your clothes every time you wash it?
They do, and that gets into the wastewater stream, and it's very difficult to filter that out. You can filter that out in your home, and we have lots of suggestions about how to reduce.
Well, as an
those.
example, how can you do that? Because I want people here to walk out of here with at least one, maybe more than one remedy for what they might do to participate in solving this problem. Well, what's one thing you fasten to your wash machine?
Right, so microfibers, a big issue. So there's a company that calls the Guppy Friend bag, and it's a polyacrylate bag that actually can trap microfibers, and you put your synthetic fabrics into that when you wash them. But the way you wash your clothes has a really big impact as well. So if you put like shoes in with your soft stuff, it's going to break the fibers. So keep soft stuff together. If you do it really hot, that tends to break fibers as well. So wash your clothes in cooler temperatures. The spin cycle, if it's super fast, like a centrifuge, that can tend to break fibers as well. So, and air drying your clothes makes a huge difference, because if you don't put them in the dryer, then they don't get fragile and brittle. And your clothes will last a lot longer, and not washing them as much. I mean, a lot of times you wear it once, and
Tell my wife that.
And if you air it out, then you can wear it again without having to wash it every single time you sweat in something. So I think all those can really increase the longevity of your clothing, and reduce the microfibers that are putting in your waste stream.
For Dune Ives, talk to us, if you will, about the impacts on health. I mean, you hear people talk about, even if you have the most cursory engagement with this issue over the last few years, you hear them talk about, it affecting reproductive systems and in animal species and humans as well. What are some of the primary health effects that you're aware of now?
So I think we're just starting to learn what the health effects are of plastic waste in our water, in our ocean, in our marine ecosystem. To animals, it's becoming more and more clear, but to humans, we're only starting to better understand how much plastic is showing up in some of the things that we eat and we drink. So globally, 83% of tap water, 94% of water in bottled water has shown to have plastic microfibers. So we're drinking it, That can't be
Regardless
good.
of the manufacturer.
Regardless of the manufacturer, regardless of where you are in the world. In the United States, I believe the stat is 94% of tap water sampled in the United States had plastic in it. So this isn't an issue that's away, that's so far away, or in a developing world. This is right here in our own backyards. Every sample of sea salt that has been tested has shown plastic microfibers. And in the audience, are there people who like to eat seafood? Show yourself. Who are you? You live on Long Island. Who likes to eat seafood? Shellfish? Yeah. You're probably eating about 11,000 particles of plastic every single year. So the fact is that we're ingesting it, we're drinking it, we're breathing it. We've seen the studies now that show it's not just your food and what you drink, but in your home there's so much dust and plastic that's coming up, we're breathing it as well. We have no idea what the impact of this is going to be on human health, but it can't be good. And there are opportunities for us now, because knowledge is power, right? So now that we know, now that we have this awareness of how much plastic we're producing, where it's going, and the impact it's having on the marine environment and animals, and that we're now ingesting it, this is the perfect opportunity for us to start reducing and to start allowing this to happen in our environment before we start to understand the effects of it.
And for Tierney, I wanted to ask you, the cheat sheet here says worst products, but what I want to know is, what are the products you think are, relatively speaking, easy to eliminate or reduce in our lives that you think are problematic? What should we be doing less of, beyond straws at Starbucks and things like that?
Well, it really is the packaging. I mean, and the plastic bottles. I mean, the water that you get in your plastic water bottle, it takes much more. Are you still there? It takes more water to make that bottle than the water that's in the bottle you're drinking. And it has a large carbon footprint as well when it's coming from exotic countries and from springs far away. So it has a carbon footprint as well. So plastic bottles, if you're in a place that has really good drinking water, like New York City, for instance, has really good drinking water, then tap water should be the water of choice. And all these, health spas, and when you're doing yoga and you're trying to be good to your body and you're drinking out of a plastic water bottle, there's just a discontinuity there.
And you don't think there's any preferred plastic water bottle? Because if you're like me, you live in this, with this, I'm not going to say it's a myth, but I'm asking you, is it a myth, where some water companies have the thicker form of plastic bottle that's viewed as the better plastic bottle? Like, without naming names, let's just say there's a company that rhymes with Roland Bings. And they say that company is a very thin, super lightweight plastic, and that those cases sit on loading docks and bake in the sun, and particulate plastic is released inside the bottle itself, and you want to drink another brand that rhymes with Ouija.
Mm-hmm. Right. Which is very
well, I'm just saying that, but is
right.
that nonsense that some plastic bottles are better than others? That's baloney?
I think
basically?
They all have a huge footprint. And when they break down, they actually emit greenhouse gases like ethylene and methane as well. So all of them have a huge footprint. So when you're getting down to which one's better than the other, it's really, the point is sort of moot, because putting water in a plastic bottle like that, it's not sustainable.
So would it be, so the single-use stuff, I mean, an easy one is plastic bags. There seems to be moves afoot everywhere you go. Out here, the Suffolk County law, about 5 cents for a bag, seems to be, I mean, even today, literally today, I did what I always do. I get to the doorway of the IGA, and I was like, shit. And I run back to the car, and I've got the cloth bag in the car, and I go get it, because I'm sick of all the paper bags. But beyond that, beyond those day-to-day things, are there any surprises you know of, other things we need to avoid using?
Well, certainly cosmetics. I think when we exfoliate, there are little plastic beads in our cosmetics, and plasticizers in a lot of our cosmetic materials. And so making sure that the product that you're using to make yourself more beautiful is actually helping to make the planet more beautiful.
So are there products that are more eco-friendly?
Yeah, absolutely.
And is there a website, without you endorsing those products, is there a website people can go to where they could read about them?
Well, a lot of the, Dune, do you want to, I know
Go
this,
ahead,
this
Dune.
is part of Dune's.
Tell us about that website, Dune.
Not that I use them. I need to use them more, I think. A little facial would do me some good, I think, right now. But Lush is a great cosmetics company. So Lush is made both in North America as well as in London and in Asia. And they really led the effort in the United States to pass the most comprehensive, the first ban on plastic microbeads. That really was a game changer for the pharmaceutical industry. And what we saw there is we saw the industry kind of rising up and putting forward their own beautiful legislation that on the surface of it looked great, because in it, it said that we will only include biodegradable plastic microbeads in our products. And you're like, well, what's a biodegradable plastic microbead? There's no such thing as a biodegradable plastic microbead. It actually doesn't exist. But it felt really good, and because the industry was putting it forward, then everybody was like, oh, well, this looks great. Legislators were getting ready to pass it, and then Five Gyres Institute, alongside of Lush, did this big campaign across North America and really awakened everybody to there is no such thing as a plastic microbead, biodegradable. You need to start paying attention to this and pass sweeping legislation at the federal level.
So when you mention cosmetics, I mean, of course, you know, this is a very, we talked about this backstage, what a difficult topic this is, because most people, I think, that we know who live out here and places we live, regardless of whether you live in the greater New York area or not, they have an amount of consciousness. They are recycling, and they are separating their plastic and their glass and their metal and their newspapers and their magazine. And they're making this effort, which is making a modest dent in the problem. And my next question for you, because I want to get to you about U.S. Major polluters and everything, but my next question for you is that is the problem more consumers and downstream and people, what they do with this material, or is the problem industry itself, or both? Can you describe the responsibility on both sides? And also mention another product, if you can, beyond single use like plastic bags, straws, packaging, and things like that we see in our lives every minute of every day. You mentioned about cosmetics. Are there microplastics and other things that we're not aware of as well?
Yeah, so individuals do play a role, right? I think if every single one of us is sorted like good boys and girls that we're supposed to, we compost, we recycle, we buy things that don't have a lot of packaging on it, it definitely makes a dent. I think corporations always pay attention to what you buy. You look at McDonald's and their announcement, the year 2025 is when they hope to have 100% recycled packaging or compostable packaging, sustainable packaging. And that's because that's what their customers are asking for. So at home, you can make a difference. You can make yourself known with the corporations that you care about. If you invest in companies, there might be a few of you in here that have some investment portfolios that might be investing in, say, fast-moving consumer goods, for example. Then you can make it known that there is brand risk associated with their brand being associated with packaging that might end up in the belly of a sea turtle or a whale or a bird, and that's bad for business. So as an individual, you can do it, but recycling is not going to save us. These corporations have a very significant and important role to play. Most of the corporations that we think of when we think about marine litter and plastic pollution are headquartered here in the United States, or they're headquartered in the EU somewhere. And they have a responsibility to make sure that not only is their packaging recyclable, but that it can be recycled. So we have this situation now where a lot of the goods that are coming out of these US and EU headquartered companies are being sold in parts of the world that have zero waste management infrastructure. That seems a little egregious to me, right? Now that you know, as a corporation, you have a responsibility to act. And I think that's important.
You call that end of?
End of life.
End of life.
It's called circular economies. So beginning with the end in mind.
You want the corporations to be responsible for the end of life of the plastic product.
I do. I think we have to meet in the middle. It's not every individual on the planet can't solve for this issue when you have so much packaging coming at you and there's no end in sight. It's only going to continue to increase in production. The corporations have to meet in the middle.
So if we were doing the podcast right now, if it was a radio show, this is where I would say, this is Barbara Hendrie. ID.
Thank you. So I just want to pick up on that point. So there is a principle called extended producer responsibility, where corporations actually take responsibility for the entire life cycle of their product. So not just when the product goes off the shelf, but what happens to it through its entire life, including when it becomes plastic waste. So there are countries that have legislation on extended producer responsibility, like Sweden and Norway, and the way that companies in those countries put policies into effect is they have deposit and return schemes, so that if you buy a plastic bottle, you then get money back when you return it, and they have machines everywhere in Norway so that you can return your plastic bottles.
And who's typically responsible in this country for preventing us from having that in this country?
So in this country, we don't have national legislation on plastic pollution. It's much more happening at state level. And there are a number of different states that have enacted bans on single-use plastic. But there are also, unfortunately, some state legislatures that have actually adopted bans on bans. So there are 9 states that have adopted legislation that actually prevents cities and towns and local municipalities in those states from enacting single-use plastic bans.
Like Idaho, Texas, you said, were 2 of them.
Texas not on the list yet, but Iowa, Idaho, Michigan, Minnesota, Florida, Arizona, who else? Missouri, did I say Missouri? There are 9 of them. And there is that kind of legislation pending in a number of other U.S. states. I mean,
and in New York as well, Cuomo prevented the city ban on plastic bags from being enacted statewide,
That's
correct?
Right. I think it's really important, and I actually didn't know this till I joined UN Environment, but it's important to remember that plastic is made out of fossil fuels. The basic building blocks for plastic come from oil, coal, and gas, and we have a massive fracking boom now, which is bringing the cost of shale gas down, and so it's driving a massive expansion in plastic production. So at the moment, there's something like $194 billion invested in a massive expansion of production, including 264 facilities to be started or expanded here in the United States. For petroleum, for the products, the petrochemical-based products that become the resin for plastic production. So there is a real issue there about what is driving that exponential increase.
I want to ask Dune about viable alternatives. What do you think? I mean, everybody, of course, wants to buy a product that you can see the product inside the plastic packaging. And if we don't have plastic packaging, we have a different kind of packaging, whether it's recycled paper or kind of a thicker paper, like a formed, some kind of a form-fitted cardboard, if you will, but you wouldn't be able to see the product. What's the answer in terms of viable alternatives for packaging?
So I think we love the idea that we could just buy something new and all of our sins go away. Right? Something new is going to come along and it's going to save us. And there absolutely is a need for more investment in what's called green chemistry to create packaging that is marine friendly and isn't going to do this kind of harm. But today, there are not that many alternatives. So we ran a big straw campaign this last year called Stop Sucking. It's a global campaign to get, it's funny. Right?
She said stop sucking.
Stop sucking. Because it's funny and it's a big issue. So let's have a little bit of fun with it. Just don't suck. Which turns out a lot of people actually still suck, which is kind of funny, too. And our favorite straw is no straw. Our favorite straw is no straw. It doesn't have to be a paper straw. It doesn't have to be a biodegradable plastic straw. Is only good if you have industrial composting facilities in your area. And if you aren't like me and you can actually get it into the composting bin. I mean, if you had to count on all of us to save the world every day, we'll disappoint you. Because getting these items in the right bins so they can become composted are really difficult. So every alternative right now has a cost associated with it. Even the bag that you ran out to your car to get, that has a really big footprint in comparison to a paper bag or to a plastic bag. So we have to really think about what are our choices. What are we really...
It does how?
Because of the embedded energy that goes into the production of the cotton. Where did the cotton come from? How much water did it take?
We could
Were
apply that to any product.
We could
couldn't
apply it to any product, that's right.
Better that I have that product with its single emissions involved in the production of
That's
that
exactly
to
right.
avoid countless other bags I would use.
That's exactly right. At least
Right.
yours doesn't fly through the air in the streets of New York.
Right. No whales are choking on my
No whales are
bag.
choking on your bag. That's right. So we have to think first about reducing plastics. Start there before we look for the panacea, for something that's going to solve our save our souls and get us out of this situation. But we also do need, and I think, Tierney, you've got a lot to say on this as well, about having more investment in alternatives, because it's a green field. Like the opportunity for someone to come in and make money in creating products and creating material that actually could be marine friendly is limitless at this point.
But I want to ID you for our purposes. But but Tierney, you go ahead. But I want to find out someone, if you can address this, or either of Barbara or Dune, about green chemistry. I had a question about that, which is, where is the cutting edge work in green chemistry being done now? You sit there and say, I mean, again, all I have is like urban legend. Is people telling me, you're having dinner with people in Manhattan, and someone says, they're making straws out of potatoes now.
Pasta.
There's a material they have that comes from potatoes. And they make straws, and you're sitting there going, that's fantastic. And you feel this kind of orgasm of public consciousness. And you're like, oh, thank God. They got the potatoes now, they're making straws. I feel so much better. What is the cutting edge of green chemistry?
So we're actually seeing a lot of material innovation around using hemp. So one of my big things, and Amazon knows this, I talked to them about this, that all the packaging that goes into the boxes, when you get a box from Amazon and it comes with these like puff things, right? In your box, in your batteries, you buy one package of tiny little batteries and it's encased in plastic packaging to fill it so it doesn't move around in the box. So there's a company that's now making that filler out of hemp, which is really exciting. There's a company that's making straws out of kelp, and it's flavored, so you can get your cherry straw if you want, just like when you were a kid. So there are material innovations, Mango Materials in the Bay Area.
Yeah, and I work with a great group called Think Beyond Plastic, which is totally targeted at looking for innovative solutions to replacing and rethinking plastic as a material. Now, bear in mind, plastic is not just one material. There's so many different types of plastic, and that's why it's such a hard thing to recycle, because you have different resins. And so if you just put it all in together, it takes energy to separate those resins into their utility. 1 is different from 2, is different from 3. But so in replacing that, there's all sorts of different materials that will have different properties specific to the type of plastic that you need to replace. And huge entrepreneurial opportunities there. But so some of the materials that are looking really promising include from algae. Agar has some properties that are quite
What is
attractive.
agar?
Agar is a derivative from red algae that has, I think most people are familiar with it. It's kind of a jelly-like, and it can be used as a thickener. And so that there's groups looking at algal replacements. There's groups looking at fungal replacements. I think Dell Computer was making their packaging out of fungal material. There's wood cellulose and wood fiber. Like Carlsberg Brewery is trying to find a way of replacing their bottles so that you could have a carbonated beverage in the bottle, and that would be a coup, because there's a lot of plastic bottles that hold carbonated beverages, and so their bottle would be made out of wood fiber. L'Oreal is also working to make their packaging. They have a line called Seed Side of Cuticles or something like that. And they're making their package out of paper. And Driscoll, those plastic clamshells, all the berries come in plastic now. You go to the grocery store and everything's in plastic. They're working on trying to replace those plastic clamshells with perhaps paper or clay, and then have a little transparent window on it. That's
Plastic.
well, maybe, but it's at
But
least
less plastic, yeah.
At least it's
Sometimes
less,
the answer is just less plastic.
less
You
plastic.
can't eliminate
Yeah,
it.
yeah. So I mean, there's huge opportunities here, and as Dune was saying, there are there are funds there like Sky Ocean Venture and Circularity Capital that are gathering funds to help catalyze this kind of innovation. Because if you can crack that nut, you're gonna, there's huge money-making opportunities for replacing plastic with a more sustainable material.
I got a series of questions for you about major polluting areas of the world and so forth. But I wanted to ask, would you imagine that this abundance of plastic in water has some neurological effect on people? And I wonder what the plastic count is in the water in the White House. That's the word it leads me to right now. Anyway, this was on my mind. I wonder what's going on with the
No
water
comment
there.
from the United Nations.
In the downtown Northwest Washington area, what the water quality is. So Barbara Hendrie, major polluting regions of the world. I mean, the United States on a per capita basis is as bad as it gets, pretty much, correct? But we're not the worst in the world overall.
Well, it depends how you measure it. So if you look at the countries that are generating those plastic waste that's finding its way into the marine environment, the majority of those are actually countries in Asia, which have growing populations, a growing middle class, so growing
economies,
growing demand for consumer goods, and not always very fantastic waste management and recycling infrastructures. But if then it's relatively easy to say, well, it's those guys over there are the problem. It's not to do with us. But the point is, it's a global issue. And if you look at the United States, where we lead is per capita the generation of plastic packaging waste. We are absolutely #1 in plastic packaging waste, followed by the European Union, followed by Japan. The other statistic that's really, I think, pretty shocking is we're not very good at recycling. So it's only 9.5%.
What do you attribute that to? Because they just can't monetize it in certain areas of the country?
I think I don't.
To create a market for it, correct?
There needs to be a market. So a lot of plastic waste just doesn't have much value, particularly in Asian countries. A lot of it is picked up by individual waste pickers who tend to be the poorest people, but they don't pick up 80% of it because 80% of it is just not worth their while to pick up, which shows you how little value it can have. In the US, we have a lot of land, we have a lot of space, so a lot of our waste management is based on landfill, compared to, say, Europe, which has much less space and has found other ways to manage its solid waste. Such as incineration, such as waste to energy.
What are the toxifying results of that? I mean, is there an air pollution component there?
There is certainly.
Dune is shaking her head very grimly.
It's not good.
There is an issue, but it's also the technology is improving to capture that. So I think the other point that I want to make is that the countries, the sort of 6 worst offending countries in Asia, have actually started to step up and recognize the problem. I want to give a shout out to Indonesia, which is #2 in plastic waste generation. And in consequence of our campaign called Clean Seas to reduce single-use plastic, Indonesia just recently committed $1 billion of investment to cut marine plastic waste by 70% by 2025. Thailand has just made plastic waste one of its national priority issues and has started a public-private partnership to try and address it. So they are trying to take action, and I think it's really important that we support them and think of this as a global issue instead of, oh, well, it's just those guys over there.
Describe for people here, I mean, obviously we mentioned Norway as one example, and I've worked with UNDP talking about indigenous peoples and the protection of indigenous lands, some of that funded by the Norwegian government, and this very kind of like mind-bendingly generous program they have as a result of all of their oil wealth. But beyond Norway, what other countries or even states within the United States are quote-unquote either doing better or really getting it right? What's a country you think has got, or doing some programs, whether it's recycling or, it doesn't really matter, where you think that their approach to the plastics issue is exemplary?
So I like Ireland. Ireland instituted a tax. I happen to be in favor of government regulation. I think government regulation on disposable single-use plastics has a real role to play, and we have seen that it can have an impact. Ireland instituted a tax on single-use plastics. I'm not sure exactly how much. About 5 years ago, they now have a reduction in about 90% of use of single-use plastic disposables. It's really, really possible. In Suffolk County, by the way, where I grew up, the 5-cent ban on plastic bags, Newsday reported in June that has meant that 43% of shoppers, I'm not quite sure how they did this survey, now use reusable bags instead of plastic disposable bags.
That's amazing.
These things, they catalyze action, but also they send a signal to the market. So Kenya, which has one of the most robust plastic bans. You can actually go to jail in Kenya for using a plastic bag. And that shocked a lot of people and had a lot of unintended consequences. But what it's meant is that a lot of manufacturers in Kenya are now voluntarily going to the environment minister and saying, what can we do? We want to step up, because they see the writing on the wall. So if we send the signal to the market will respond.
Who's a U.S., I'm going to get to you next with a question for Tierney, but who's a U.S., or name a couple if you want to, U.S. corporations who you think are doing exemplary work in this area as well? Can you think of one?
Defer that question to
Yeah,
Dune in
I'd be
the
happy to.
interest
Let's
of
ask Dune then.
non-disclosure of specific companies.
Go ahead,
I'm
Dune.
happy to. I think McDonald's is doing a remarkable job.
And why? Why?
Two reasons why. So when you look at all the corporate commitments that are out there, there's a really clear, easy way to figure out, did the corporation get it right, or was it just kind of, we'll just do this goal? And that is whether or not they hit the UN Environment's Sustainable Development Goal 14.1 date of the year 2025, by when we have to significantly reduce the amount of marine litter that we have. McDonald's hit 2025. There are other corporations that are focused on 2030 or even a little bit later, but they're really focused on creating innovation within their supply chain to get to sustainable packaging. They also are one of the only ones who publicly will say, we understand that we are opening one new store almost every single day in a part of the world that has no waste management infrastructure. We have to solve for that. And so we look at Lonely Wow, we look for which corporations are out there really publicly committing to the right date, the right goal. They are owning it, they're accountable to it, and McDonald's, from our perspective, is really at the top of the list.
All three of you any one of you can answer this question. Who in the Congress of the United States, Senate or House, or who in a state house, or who in a regulatory agency is doing work that you're admiring of?
So I don't know if people are aware, but there is legislation that was introduced by 2 Republican senators, Senator Sullivan and Murkowski, and 2 Democratic senators, Whitehouse and Cory Booker, called Save the Seas, which does really important things. It was passed by the Senate last year and just recently passed by the House of Representatives. And it does 2 things. It calls on the U.S. administration to direct the State Department to support and demonstrate American leadership on marine plastic pollution globally, focused on some of the hot spots in the world. So it's a recognition by Congress that this is a global issue and the U.S. should show leadership. And the second thing it does is it provides congressional authorization for the Marine Debris Program for 5 years, so that program cannot be cut. What I think is amazing is this passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in both houses, and it was introduced in a bipartisan way. So it tells me that this is an issue that generates support across the aisle. And actually, I think we need to really encourage our congresspeople to see this issue as a key issue and make sure America continues to show leadership on it.
Now, for Tierney, I want to mention that, I'm focusing some of this from the perspective of lay people who aren't experts in their field the way the 3 of you are. And we talked backstage about, the Pacific garbage patch, and everybody thinks that this is just this giant slam of toxic bouillabaisse just percolating in the ocean, and plastic breaking down into microparticles and oozing into the ocean. And is it true that it is the size of Texas, or some crazy analogy?
Well, it's actually probably bigger than that.
Right.
Because
Thanks, Tierney.
You have both the western and the eastern parts, and they are coming together.
And what do you think can conceivably be done about that? Is it going to sit there forever?
Well, we do call them, all the major ocean basins have gyres, these anticyclonic circulation patterns, and we call them the toilets that don't flush. And so, yes, there is an effort to, you do want to clean that up. If it's just sitting there.
How do you clean it up?
And it's, but let me preface this with saying that the amount, if you want to stop a problem, like you're filling up the bathtub and it's spilling over, do you sop up the water that's spilling over, or do you turn the tap off?
But even if you turn the tap off, what are you going to do about
to really turn the tap off?
Right, but once you do that, what do you do about this thing that's breaking down into microplastics into the ocean? Can it be cleaned up or no?
Well, it's not very cost effective to do that because it's such a vast
Doesn't it have to be, though?
No, I think there's multiple solutions. There's multiple solutions. And so you can, there's projects like the Ocean Cleanup Project that's coming up with ways of, sending out autonomous structures that will then slurp up, essentially like a big vacuum cleaner, and slurp up from the surface. The density of particles, I think the public has a misconception of what the garbage patch looks like, because it's not an island of trash. It's so dispersed, on the order of like 10 kilograms per square kilometer. Some places 100 kilograms per square kilometer, which is nothing. You think a square kilometer, 10 kilograms. It's very spread out. And so to try and slurp all that up.
So it's not like the images you saw of the Dominican Republic recently, where there's plastic washed up in like a giant mass, like a giant garbage dump.
No, but that said, a lot of the macroplastics are fishing nets. A study just came out from the Ocean Cleanup team in Science Reports just earlier this year, saying a lot of it are fishing nets, which entangle, millions of species and lead to the death of millions of cetaceans and turtles and seabirds every year. So we do want to get that out. It's very tricky trying to do that in such a vast area, and there's limited amount of funding for tackling this problem. And so projects like the Ocean Cleanup Project attract a huge amount of investment, upwards of $40 million right now. And latest report, they said they want to raise $350 million. And that's a chunk of change, which I think we could do a lot of stopping the tap with those funds. But I love the, the inspiration and innovation coming from the team, but I think it's really just a very small part of the solution.
Years ago, I went with a group of people. They were going to have, this is many years ago, probably 30 years ago, and some people in this room may remember that there was a proposal in Albany when Cuomo was in office, to pass what was called the Environmental Bond Initiative. It was what seems like now kind of not a paltry amount of money, but a more modest amount of money. They were going to sell bonds and raise $1.1 billion. This was right after the Big Green Initiative in California, and it was modeled after that to raise money, and it was broken down, and herein lies the death of the bill and why it all ended, because one side of the aisle wanted $800 million of it to go toward construction of waste disposal sites and brick and mortar. And the other side wanted $800 million to go to land preservation and more passive measures, and leave the remaining $300 million to that. And one of the things that I went to Cuomo seniors, I went to with a group of people to lobby for this bill, and one of the things we wanted attached to it was money to train teachers for environmental education in the schools, to have mandatory environmental education, to create a curriculum and have it to, and the biggest obstacle, and they had very legitimate reasons, but it was an obstacle nonetheless, was the teachers union and the National Education Association, which said, they're constantly in the crosshairs of people demanding, well, we want you to teach this, and not providing them the resources to train their membership and train teachers to do this, which is very time consuming and very expensive. So the measure died, the bill in New York. But I think it died. I don't think that'll get passed. But this idea of environmental education, I feel like everywhere we go now, It's like it's like when you talked about, for example, a legislative approach or passing laws that would force corporations to do this. I really feel like we're at a point, and I want to get each of your opinion, where we really are at the point where there's things that we must do now. And I want to ask each of the three of you, because we are going to take some questions in a little bit. I want to ask the three of you, if you could do something right now, we'll start with you, Dune, Ives. If you could make one change right now, and you could press a button and make it so, of something you'd like to see happen in relation to this issue, what would it be?
I would put a ban on multi-layer packaging. So multi-layer packaging are parents in the room, right? So your children, do they ever drink the pureed peas from the suck bag, I call it? It's the bag that you squeeze and they eat the food. It can't be recycled. And it's one of the most harmful plastic packaging that we have out there, and that's really on the increase.
What do we call that?
rise.
Is my wife here?
What do we call them?
My wife, we call them pouches. We don't call it a suck bag in our house. We call them pouches.
I have a house full of
Hey,
boys.
put that
That's all
suck
I have.
bag down. Don't throw that suck bag in the garbage.
But it's particularly
Pouches.
troubling, so they can't be recycled, and so now there's
So there's
all
types of
sorts-
products you'd like to eliminate them entirely.
I would, yeah, and can I add one more? Can I have two, please? Two?
You're our guest by all
Okay, thank
means,
you.
Dune.
So a second one. So I love what China did this last year. So for those who are following it, China passed something called the Green Sword policy, and essentially what they did is they said no, thank you to the developed countries to send our trash over there for them to deal with. So for years, the United States, other developed countries have been sending our trash elsewhere. China, for one. And when China closed the doors and said, you're going to have to deal with it yourself, all of a sudden what started happening is in cities like New York and Seattle, where I'm from, our trash, our recyclables, our valuables started piling up. Well, instead of figuring out what do we do with this, what's the innovation, the entrepreneurial innovation, and how do we actually create a closed-loop cycle within our own communities, we start sending it to Vietnam. So or Malaysia, and we pay them to take it and burn it, or landfill it, or something happens to it. So
you want that to end?
I would love all these countries we've pegged as the big offenders. Close the doors. Close the doors to the developed countries. Don't let us send our trash your way. Make us deal with it.
Barbara Hendrie.
So that $194 billion that's being invested in a global plastic economy, which is the way we have it now, which is really about taking, making, and disposing, I would transition that into investment in a plastic economy that is circular, so that, excuse me, we think about the end of life of products and we design in value so that we don't end up with waste in the environment.
Tierney.
Well, most of the plastic getting into the ocean is coming out of our rivers. It's 80% of it is land-based. So I would implement at the major rivers things like trash wheels and ways of collecting that before it gets out to the ocean in the first place.
Where's our friend who's here from Surfrider? To tell us about. Can we get the lights up just for 1 second? Can we get the lights up? Give me your name again. Andrew Brosnan, who's from Surfrider out here in the East End. Let's have a round of applause for Andrew. Tell me about your sewage sock you were describing to me before.
I've yet to actually research it too closely, but what it is a large mesh bag that goes on the end of the sewer system, wherever the discharge is, and that would collect the plastic and other detritus that's coming down from the rivers, et cetera, and then that bag is removed and replaced by a fresh bag. So the idea is...
Is there somewhere this is being done now?
Again, I saw this today and was intrigued by it. You know, the wheels that were mentioned.
Describe those for people. What are those like?
It's a passive water wheel apparatus. It's solar powered. It's driven by the current of the water. Currently, Huntington Harbor has one in California. As the water flows past it, it circles through the water. It picks up the trash, skims the surface, picks up the trash, puts it into a dumpster, and that dumpster is replaced on a regular basis, depending on the flow and the volume of trash in that particular area.
What's some of the things that Surfrider's working on out here?
Well, you know, you mentioned that removing straws is not going to save us all. But what we've found is, and again, you talked about education, so hopefully I can tie this all together real quickly. The way we got into Strawless Summer, which is one of our campaigns here on the East End, and we currently have 44 restaurants that are providing paper straws only upon request instead of plastic straws, so they're greatly reducing the amount of waste altogether, and certainly the plastic waste, was started by a 12-year-old girl who showed up at Marie, who showed up at one of our chapter meetings and said, I'm tired of all these plastic straws, I don't understand them, and we'd like to see something done. She travels between East Hampton and Hawaii. She's working in Kauai on a program similarly, and it was the start of the Strawless Summer campaign here on Eastern Long Island. And again, we do a lot of beach cleanups. We set a goal of 1 ton of trash, 2,000 pounds. We collected that in January in 4 beach cleanups. So we took all that trash and we made this float of marine debris, and we entered it in 3 of the St. Patrick's Day parades out here in March. So we finished first in West Hampton Beach. We finished first in Hampton Bays. We even finished first out in Montauk, so 3 for 3. But more importantly, there's a turtle that is made entirely out of straws and Mylar balloons. His nickname is Eli, Eastern Long Island, in case nobody caught up on them. But Eli travels to all the school districts out here on the East End. And so there is a curriculum being developed to educate the students about plastics in the waste stream, about straws, and about these Mylar balloons, which unfortunately we see far too many of here in the Hamptons and offshore. So,
Quick question before I want to have a couple more items with our guests here, but what's your website? easternli.surfrider.com. And you can reach me at the chairman at that easternli.surfrider.com.
Correct.
Is your website. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you. And what were the things you do right away? What was your answer you said?
Well, implementing, stopping the trash from getting out in the first place.
Right.
But then
Collection.
also, but then also at the individual level, really making your voices heard with that corporations need to keep in mind the whole cycle of their materials, that they need to have responsibility for the materials that they manufacture their whole life. And that needs to, I know that's at the corporate level, but individuals can make that be known and press for legislation.
No, but there are corporations because I don't know what the economics are, I don't know what the chemical properties of different plastics are that makes one more marketable than the other in the recycling stream. But what typically are the plastics that are the most valuable that we use every day? What can be saved? Because I'm going to give you my answer at the 2 things I'd like to do tomorrow if I had my way. But what's the most recoverable and monetized type of plastic in our lives?
So the most recoverable right now are PET bottles, plastic bottles. So water bottles, beverage bottles. They're high value. Yeah,
they are.
They're high value.
So plastic water bottles that we drink, Fiji, Poland Springs, I'm sorry.
Those are high value.
Ouija. Roland Bings. All those things, those are valuable in the stream.
Those are valuable in the stream. Coca-Cola has made a proclamation by the year 2030. They will recover a 1-for-1, kind of a like for a like, not their own bottles necessarily, but of the 140 billion that they produce annually globally. By the end of 2030, they will have recovered 140 or whatever they're producing at that point, because it's such high value and they can reincorporate that.
See, because when you think about the stuff that can't be used or is more difficult to use, the 2 things I would like, if I could make it so tomorrow, the one I would do was I would institute some federal program of collecting plastics and paying people by the pound for those plastics. And if you separate it on the most basic level, you took right off the top the ones that you knew there was a market for them to be reused, like the water bottle. You have a clear indication as to, it's very binary. One group goes into this stream, and the other group goes into this stream, and we shred it, and we pack it. And even though it isn't being reused, it's not going to go into the ocean because we pack it down and condense it into something that we then bury in the ground. We don't incinerate it, but we'd have to bury it eventually. But you get the government to pay people by the pound to recycle. We could use decommissioned military bases and have everything, have collection centers and have it all brought there to where you separate. I mean, I think that the government has to get into the recycling business in the plastic situation, maybe not with paper and glass and things like that, which aren't, I don't know if newsprint from the New York Times is turning up in the salmon that you're eating, but plastic is the biggest problem, that we address that. And the second thing I would argue for is education in the schools, that we have to turn every boy and every girl in this country into some AirSats kind of Boy Scout, Girl Scout, where you learn about what we're doing and the cost that it's going to have to us. Because I think even if the government did the collection thing I'm talking about, even if the government did this and it cost a lot of money, it's going to cost us so much more money down the road to deal with this issue and getting this toxicity out of our lives. You go right
I was
ahead,
just going to
Barbara.
say, one of the, there's a lot of grim facts and issues that we've talked about today, but actually one of the incredibly hopeful things is how switched on young people are to this issue. It's incredible. So Lonely Whale Foundation and UN Environment Program collaborated this year on something called the Ocean Heroes Boot Camp, where young people from all over the world came and made presentations and talked about how in their entrepreneurial way, were going to go back to their countries and combat plastic pollution. And it was absolutely incredible. So it's really hopeful because young people really are. I mean, they're going to save us if we can hang on until they can
Tierney.
vote.
Yeah, and there's a new program right at National Geographic that's launching next week, so you guys are getting the inside scoop. It'll be announced next week. It's a program called the Geo Challenge. So we have the Geo Bee, and like you'd have a national spelling bee, but this is a Geo Challenge, and this year's topic is plastic pollution. And it's specifically for middle schoolers, and anyone can sign up. You just have to have a teacher sponsor your team, and you come up with a solution, you make a physical model, you make a video, and then you enter a competition. There'll be regional competitions, and then the winners will go to DC. So that's another thing that National Geographic is doing, and then an enormous amount of resources on our website and our latest issue, our June issue.
You have to read this issue.
A really terrific issue, worth checking out. We have some copies out there for you to take home. Well, not everyone
And
gets
it's
one.
called Planet or Plastic.
Planet or Plastic, yeah. And I love the cover.
Isn't it great
That's
when
a
you work at the
plastic.
National Geographic, you can just do that. You go, we have on the cover of our latest issue. And you're like, a format we were all very familiar with.
And it also has a bunch of tips in there, for how to reduce your plastic footprint.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. One last question before we go to questions from the audience, and that's for Barbara Hendrie. I'm sure the answer to this is a very complicated one and a very lengthy one, but in just a thumbnail, what's the UN working on right now as far as plastics pollution is concerned?
So we've been working on the marine environment and plastic pollution for many, many years. As we work with partner governments. But what has changed in the last couple of years, given how acute the problem has gotten, is that we've actually become much more activist. If you know anything about the UN, you know how radical that is, for the UN to get activist. So we launched a campaign early last year called Clean Seas, Turn the Tide on Plastic, specifically aimed at dramatically reducing the consumption and production of single-use plastics. And we've used that campaign to catalyze action from governments. And we have now over 60 governments that have made really significant commitments, including India, who in June committed to completely eliminate single-use plastics by the year 2025. So we are very forward-leaning on this, and along with the programs that we have going on.
What was the thing I was reading? It was called GPML. What was that happened? Was that in Charlevoix?
Charlevoix was the G7 summit hosted by Canada, who's the president of of the G7 this year. And what happened in the G7 summit was also really important. Excuse me. 5 of the G7 countries and the European Union adopted something called the Ocean Plastic Charter. It's the first time that there has been a specific agenda for action by governments at that level of visibility and at that level of diplomacy. It basically, I would encourage you all to look at it. You can Google Ocean Plastic Charter G7. It's basically a menu for what governments in partnership with industry will do. So what's important about that is that the global intergovernmental conversation on this issue is really starting to take off, which I think is also really hopeful.
Before we bring up the house lights, you work with the United Nations, so we pretty much can guess what your website would be. You work with National Geographic, we can pretty much guess what your website would be. And Think Beyond, what's your website for Think Beyond Plastics? ThinkBeyondPlastic.org. And Lonely Whale, what is their?
Lonelywell.org.
There we go, okay. My last question for this panel, for at least for now, is everybody in this room, you want them to walk out of here and you want them to do what starting tomorrow? That's for Dune.
It's not a shared question. So you each have a very powerful next step that you can take. And a lot of it depends on who you are and what you're willing to do as individuals. You can make a choice. You can buy that English cucumber wrapped in plastic or not. Please don't. You can talk with your friends and your neighbors and your network. I can't tell you how many times I come out to Long Island and I'm sitting down with somebody like, oh yeah, Billy Joel just came over this weekend, or Governor Cuomo, or everybody has this amazing network out here. Talk to people about what your priorities are. Make a difference, make your voice known of what you want your future to be like. And if you are investors, if you have companies that you invest in, if you have an investment portfolio, there is no greater power that you have today than talking about brand risk associated with a brand's packaging ending up in the ocean. I can't tell you how strong that is. There's a reason why some of these corporations are moving, and it has everything to do with the risk that investors are starting to see associated with plastic pollution. So there's something you can decide to do with your purchasing, with how you talk about it, and then with how you place your priorities on your investments, and all three of those are really important.
Maybe we could have some famous local artists design bags for us to do our grocery shopping in.
Are there
Wouldn't that
any
be
in the
cool?
audience?
What a thought. Let's bring the lights up and we're going to take a few questions, please. April, let's bring the microphone down here, please.
Thank you. Thanks. When I first heard reduce, recycle, reuse, I thought, yay, this is a good idea. Now I realize that we've been through, how many years has that been around? Like 20 years or something? Now I realize we're all just completely brainwashed by this idea that when we put our number 1 and 2 plastic for recycling here on Long Island, because you can't recycle number 5 here. My sanitation person says that they do it, but I don't really trust them. 6 you can do nothing with, 7 you can do nothing with. Styrofoam is the plastic from hell. So I realize that we're all being mollified by the plastics industry to think that if we recycle, it's okay. And when you buy again and again and again the Fiji water or the Poland Spring, I don't care what it is, people ought to buy metal bottles. They ought to have drinking water that's potable and clean and not contaminated. And this whole idea that all of America now is used to buying their drinking water is insane. It just means that we've become used to this idea that our water is normally polluted. And that's so wrong, and I think that you actually have to dial back from everything that you've been saying, and it's been great. But I think we have to go back to the whole issue of water quality and get that straightened out and put a filter on your tap if you have decent water, but you're still worried about it. I just wanted to say that. What can you imagine we could do legislatively to demand clean water and to stop plastic industries from wastefully wrapping things in plastic that you then get a plastic bag at your grocery store to put in. I mean, it's completely loony when you think about it. So legislatively, do you have any suggestions?
So about 2 weeks ago, I presented at the National Caucus for Environmental Legislators. They exist. There are like 500 state-level legislators who care deeply about the environment. About 140 of them from 38 different states came to LA to all learn about plastic. And this is a group of guys and gals that can make change happen. And so we talked a lot about plastic bottles. We talked a lot about water quality, and we talked a lot about this idea, exactly what you just said. I don't know who you are, but I adore you, and we are going to talk a lot after this, because yes to everything you said. But a lot about this idea that we have been really asleep at the wheel for a long time around plastics.
Does the plastic industry show up at meetings like that? Do they like sneak representatives in?
No, God, I love the way you think. Oh, there are conference calls I'm on. I'm like, did anybody do a real call? Is this password protected? Because there's the plastics industry is on this call. I know they're on this call because they're smart. They're very smart. But I think what you're saying is really important. So the straw campaigns, yeah, it's about straws. Yes, it's about kids. It's actually about changing normative behaviors. It's no longer cool when Kim Kardashian gets called out on social media as she did. It becomes uncool to have a straw in your mouth, a plastic straw. Yeah. Water bottles, we have to do the exact same thing. We have to change the normative behavior. It shouldn't be normal to reach for a plastic bottle of water that actually costs you 2,000% more than the water you would get out of your tap. It's an environmental nightmare. So we have to change that.
But for those
behavior.
people but I want to just mention, and I'm going to get to you, Barbara, in a moment. But for those people where the tap water is problematic, I mean, I'm exec producing a documentary right now with this guy, Anthony Baxter, about the Flint water crisis and what was done there. And when you see the facts of what was done and how the government dealt with it, it's really, really shameful and it's really, really appalling. Yes. And out here on Long Island, I mean, we've spoken to people for decades. I mean, for decades here, we've talked to people about, porous, sandy soil and aquifers and the magathy and the this and the that, and how, the primary, secondary, and tertiary aquifers for Nassau County are completely overrun by phosphates and from aggressive turf management programs in lawn care, golf courses and so forth, herbicide, pesticide, fungicide, the east end of Long Island, duck farming, potato farming, the Long Island legendary potato farming, some of the most aggressive chemical applications of any product known to man. Fungicide, herbicide, pesticide in potato production. I mean, the groundwater here is saturated with chemicals for decades and decades and decades. And so when you say to people, just turn on the tap, some people, you turn on the tap, it's actually a bit worse. But what I want to get to is this idea that the tobacco companies created a product where after a certain point, people were basically hip to the fact that it was killing people, and they were lying. They knew it was killing people, and they were lying that they didn't know. And what happened was that to protect a very valuable industry, the tobacco industry made a lot of money, not just in this country, but around the world. I mean, United States tobacco products were sold around the world and made billions upon billions upon billions of dollars for the manufacturer, Lincoln Myers, all these companies. Those, the government turned around one day and they decided that the cost of dealing with people who are addicted to smoking is greater than wanting to protect tobacco-growing economies in this country. The time was right. The time was right for them, for the multiple attorneys general that came together in the litigation to drop the boom on the tobacco industry, which they did, and had these massive settlements. And that's what I think may happen in terms of plastics pollution. What you said about people arguing in court for their right to access clean water. We have a right. People say that the Bass Brothers, I mean, again, this is all urban legend. The Bass Brothers are up in the Great Lakes area buying aquifers of water, because pretty soon water will be traded, clean water will be traded like a commodity on the stock exchange, like oil and wheat, because to access really pristine, clean water will become more and more problematic in this country. But to go to court and sue and say, we're not telling you to stop making plastic products. It may get to that. What we are saying is we have a right to access clean water. And every single thing that corporations are doing, because what corporations want you to believe, and to some extent they're right, we talked about this backstage, is that you and I really are the problem. We make a product, and you should have the sense to open the package and put everything in its proper place and recycle it or dispose of it. If you don't, that's your problem. Single-use plastic consumers are the problem, not the manufacturers of the product. Mm-hmm. And there's blame to go around on both sides. But I love what you said, because that's what we need to be doing, is just keeping it very simple. We want clean water, and we deserve clean water.
It's a right.
And it's a right, and whatever leads us to that is what we're entitled to do.
But if they're making 6 and 7 plastics and they can't be recycled,
Right.
that's not true.
We can prevent them from doing that.
Yeah.
Barbara.
Well, I was just going to add on to the point about the tendency to direct attention downstream. So it's either our individual behavior because we're just not recycling, or now a sort of slightly more sophisticated spin that's coming out is what we really have to do is invest in waste management and recycling infrastructure. And that's true. We absolutely do have to do that, particularly in the kind of hotspot countries. But again, it's directing the solution downstream and away from the upstream solution, which is basically we have to turn off the tap. We have to massively reduce production and consumption. So I think don't be swayed by that argument, because we can't just be looking downstream. We have to be looking upstream.
We had this gentleman. Did you have your hand up, sir? Yeah. Could you raise your hand so the woman can bring you the mic? Here we go. We'll take a couple more.
First of all, First of all, I think it's great that we're all here. We're obviously all concerned about it, but I probably, in this audience, I mean, maybe others, have the most practical experience of manufacturing plastics, recycling plastics. I used to be chairman of a company, a publicly quoted company, that made plastics for the food industry, one-way packaging. And you probably heard from the accent, I'm from the UK, I'm from London, and the companies in the UK, the supermarket groups, I think led the way in this problem. I used to deal regularly with Marks and Spencer's. Sorry, I'm mentioning names here, but I think I'm relatively safe. Marks and Spencer's, Tesco, and so on, who are the major supermarket groups in the UK. They were the ones who led the way on this, particularly Marks and Spencer's. They insisted upon this, and there was no reason why you had to buy all sorts of fruit, salads, whatever it happened to be, in plastic, but they insisted upon it. I mean, I see today still, for example, avocados, you probably all see it, with 2 layers of packaging around the avocado. There is no need for that at all. So having seen that, I realize where it's coming from. It's really coming from the retailer. And if you're going to pressurize anyone, I think it's the retailer that you've really got to pressurize. I hear a lot of comments about pressurizing manufacturers, but I'm not sure that's the problem. The other thing is, having been experienced in recycling and starting a recycling plant, it is incredibly difficult to recycle. And you're all not agreeing with me there. It's expensive. It's very difficult to actually collect the plastic.
That's why I think the government
and to
should
separate
do
it.
That's why I think the government.
But I do think the example that you're leading here and you're giving here is where all of us can play a big role. And one thing that really inspired me was a talk I attended with a leader, a spiritual leader from Tibet. And he and a number of monks started a march that went through the Himalayas. They went through some terrible weather, actually, and not just in the good times, but also in the bad times. They were collecting plastic, hundreds and hundreds of tons of plastic. It was incredibly inspiring. I saw the film that they had made about this, because most of the water that comes into the Far East comes from the Himalayas, and they realized it was going to eventually destroy the drinking water for most of the people living in the Far East. And they took action, which was so inspiring. I think we can all take action, we can all do things.
Do you recall the name of that movie?
I'll find out who it was, but it was made by this group of monks and their spiritual leader.
Okay.
Very inspiring.
Okay.
Alec, can I just say one quick thing on that? Just, The other thing that's amazing about what happened in the UK is the BBC documentary Blue Planet 2, which no longer showed the pristine marine environments, but actually David Attenborough showed what is out there in the environment. That has hugely catalyzed public opinion, and then the government of Theresa May in the UK. So it shows you what that kind of education and awareness can do.
And Plastic Oceans is another really, really powerful documentary as well, co-produced in UK.
Something to say about policy, and recently in the East Hampton Star, it was like 9% of us, 9% of us recycle, or there was some mention how little people recycle. I have a new son-in-law who comes from Switzerland, and I put him to work, and we go to the dump, and we recycle. With the plastics in his small town in Switzerland, each family, it receives a plastic bag with a scanner, if you will, and it's their family. And if you go over and you're not recycling properly or using things, you're not buying the plastic that can't be recycled, you're fined. So that, it's not the solution, but it's a start, and I thought it was interesting. I just wanted to share that.
Yeah.
We're going to take the lady who had her hand up before. We're going to take two more quick ones, and then we're going to be out of time.
Yes, I'm a retired school teacher, and I taught science. I taught those 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, in the 80s. And when I go to the recycling center here, commonly called the dump, and I see the restrictions that they have on what you can recycle in plastic, I get very upset, and I'm wondering what we can do in East Hampton to make sure that our plastic gets recycled.
Well, as we all know, I mean, people who just give the most casual examination of this issue, the problem becomes this monetizing thing, this marketing thing, which is that, you know, we're at the end of Long Island, so to put everything in a truck and truck it in bottleneck through Manhattan, or go over the Whitestone or whatever and get somewhere with truckloads of this garbage and take it somewhere. It's very expensive. And getting people to come out here and pick it up who are going to take it away and make money off it, that's very, very tricky as well. You have to create a market for it, unfortunately. And the stuff that they're taking away that there is a market for, someone's coming to take it. We were sharing backstage how the gentleman who was the recycling czar, he was on my podcast. We had a woman on, Pam Alardo, who works for the sanitation department and is in charge of water management. She was describing basically when you flush your toilet, where does it go in New York now? And then this other gentleman came, Emily, do you remember his name? Gonan. There you go. So Gonan said to us, he was the recycling czar, and he said, all these people that are breaking into your garbage at night in Manhattan and taking, or in the 5 boroughs, and taking your garbage out of your recyclable plastics and glass and metal out of your garbage and putting it in these elephantine bags they have on top of grocery carts and stuff. He said, they're stealing property that belongs to someone who signed a contract with the city to monetize that item. So those people are taking stuff that they're going to make money off it that's ours, meaning him, the contractor. So the game of this monetizing thing, how do we monetize the product so it incentivizes somebody to come here and take it away? That's what we have to do. We're going to have time.
Alec?
Yes.
This lady has been patiently waiting.
Yes.
You've been selected.
This is the most practical thing that you can do. Do not buy polyester clothing. Polyester is 100% plastic. And when you die, all your clothes will be still hanging around. So.
Wow. What a way to finish. What a way to finish. Although I want to finish.
Most of that clothing comes from China. The Chinese have been increasing their production of polyester clothing, and if you look at the 80%, now that they'll say 80% polyester, 20% cotton. Well, the cotton is so little. So please talk to your men and women from which you buy your clothing and say, We're tired of polyester. It's hot in the summer and it's sticky and we don't want it anymore.
I want to close. Thank you. Thank you. What is your name, by the way? What is your name, by the way?
I'm a retired professor from Temple University, Jeanette Gallagher.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My wife, of course, sent me a text message in the middle of this program, knowing I would check my text messages to see if she had sent me something. And there's a list of things she has here, which are recommendations. One says, skip the sink. Don't wash your dishes by hand. Dishwashing in a machine is much more thorough by a 6-to-1 ratio. It also talks about get rid of all your old appliances. We replaced all the refrigeration in our house this year. We had these refrigerators, which they seem pretty good to me, but they were 20 years old, so we got rid of all of our refrigerators in our house this year. And the last one, which I love this one, my wife is suggesting, we all have to get a ficus plant. Because ficus plants remove certain chemicals from the air and apparently absorb all these chemicals. Listen, by the way, I want to just close by, and also I want to have a quick hello to Kevin McAllister, who's here, the former director of Peconic Baykeeper, and now he's with Defend H2O. And Kevin and I are doing a program together at the Whalers Church in Sag Harbor. On what date, Kevin? What date? The 16th. The 16th. Kevin, I'm going to be interviewing Kevin there. At the Whalers Museum in Sag Harbor on the 16th. And your website is? DefendH2O.org? Yeah. DefendH2O.org. I want to say, obviously, that when we concoct, I'm going to bring out my producing partner here in a moment, but when we concoct this and we write this program for the year, we have, 8 or 10 or 12 ideas for programs we think would really be worthy, and we want to craft, a program where we can talk to people like this and attract experts in these areas to come out here. And we couldn't think of one that was more important to us here, living in this, this kind of Eden, this Edenic setting that we live in out here, with surrounded by water. We thought that this issue of plastics pollution was something that you would find very, very interesting. But please join me in welcoming my producing partner in this evening, Tracy Marshall.
Thank you to Alec and the panel. I mean, this panel, you have been a dream to work with and such a great source of information and inspiration. So thank you for coming out. And I just really want to say that this is a really great example of what we were trying to really achieve with this summer's series. And that bringing these 3 topics, the plastics pollution issue, next week, Me Too, and then the last week, the opioid epidemic. All of these things are really, the East End and Long Island are very much affected by. And so it's great to have this interaction, and this has been a great kickoff for that. And also all the things that we've discussed, we'll put on the website. You didn't have to write down all the websites and the films and everything. So check back in on the Guildhall website on the Hamptons Institute, and we'll get you as much useful information as possible, and as well as the Surfriders and the other local groups that are helping out. So I wanted to thank you all for being committed and coming as well, and also, very importantly, our sponsors for this year. So thanks very much, and we hope to see you over the next 2 weeks as well.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Let's have a round of applause for our guests. Thank you.